Hello, hello, my asset friends. I miss you. I miss you so much. I wish we were in class together instead of doing what we're doing, but here we are. We're doing it. Um, so this is automatic and manual transmissions. We're going to start at the very beginning. I mean, the whole point of these transmissions is to add gear ratios to our vehicle. And so I'd like to talk about a few different types of gears and then go through the basics of how to calculate gear ratios because your online lab assignment this week is going to be doing just that, calculating gear ratios. So even though this worm gear is real cool, let's get going. So gear ratios, the engine inside of the vehicle has a torque curve. It has a range in which it is most powerful. It also has ranges in which it's most efficient. And so we're going to use gears and gear ratios to either use that power or use that efficiency and be able to move between those two things and also move at different speeds down the road. So relationship between the input and output gears, number of teeth on the gear, right? So oftentimes when measuring gear ratios, we just count the number of teeth on one gear and the number of teeth on the other, and then we do some math to figure out what that means as far as our gear ratio goes. So I have a drive gear and a driven gear. So this would be my input. This would be what's spinning, maybe connected to like my engine. And then I have my output, which is my driven gear. All right, so when we talk about gear ratios, you're going to hear the term driven over drive often. And so we're just saying output over input when we figure out our ratio. This is going to be an underdrive ratio for sure because I've got a small gear driving a big one. So this is going to have to spin multiple times to make this spin one time. All right, so driven over drive. And that's our 3-to-1 ratio. 24 divided by 8 is 3. So that just tells me that my little gear has to spin 3 times for every time my big gear spins once. And when we deal with ratios, it's always going to be something to 1. All right, and 1 is going to be the output. So how many times does my input need to spin to make my output spin 1 time? This is the idea that we're trying to create here. Here's a 2-to-1 ratio. So that was my output has 24 teeth. My input has 12 teeth. So 24 over 12 equals 2. Not too hard for math as far as all that goes, right? So driven over drive. And this one has a 4-to-1 gear ratio. They were nice and they counted the teeth for us. 44 teeth on our driven member, 11 teeth on our driving member. So a 4-to-1. These are all underdrive ratios right now. The diameter is a way that we could look at this as well. You could actually take a measuring tape, measure the diameter of one gear, measure the diameter of the other, and you would put the driven diameter on top, the drive diameter on the bottom, do the same type of division, and you would come up with the same ratios. A little bit easier with the teeth because we know we're being real accurate with that, but it's the same idea. It works just that way. So torque times distance. Our gear is really just a bunch of lever arms stacked on top of each other. So you can think of it as be a big gear, 2-foot radius here. So if I put 10 foot-pounds down on this 10 foot-pounds, if I put 10 pounds down, forcing downward on the end of this lever, and it's 2 feet long, I get 20 foot-pounds, right? 20 pounds per foot. Right? 2 feet, 10 pounds. Okay, I think we're all on the same page anyway. It's hard. I don't get to look at you and see you like glazed-eyed, being like, why are we in lecture right now? Can't tell. I guess this time would be a fine time to be looking at your cell phone because maybe you're watching me on your cell phone now. But, I miss the back and forth, that's for sure. And then that's just another look at it. And a gear would just be, right, I got one of these, and I got another, and another, and another, and another, and another. So as this is twisting, I can maintain the pressure in the same spot, right? Like right here. And as my gear travels, I continue to have spots to push on. So that's really all that a gear is. It's just a whole bunch of lever arms stacked in a way that I can just keep supplying some sort of force. And then this is looking at the idea that as force increases, distance decreases. See how my fulcrum's here? So I'm putting a fair amount of force on that fulcrum, but only moving my gear a small way, even though I'm having to move a long way. And this is, again, an underdrive condition. I'm sacrificing motion for torque. Another look at that same concept there. This would be a 1-to-1 gear ratio, where I put 10 pounds in, I can lift 10 pounds up, and the output movement would be the same as the input movement, right? This would be an underdrive ratio, where now, because I've changed where my fulcrum is, and I have 5 times the distance, I only have to put 2.5 pounds down to move this 10-pound weight, but I have to put that 2.5 pounds down over a greater distance than what my output distance will be. And so a 4-to-1 advantage, 4-to-1 gear ratio is what's happening there. Here we have a 2-to-1 gear ratio, and they're saying I've got 25 pound-feet, which is technically the correct way of speaking. Instead of saying foot-pounds, we're supposed to be saying pound-feet, but it just doesn't sound right because nobody says that, right? But I have 25 foot-pounds here, and I have 50 foot-pounds here, and that makes sense with the 2-to-1, right? 50 is twice as much as 25. And what happens is the same math goes along with my speed. I have 100 RPM input speed, and because of this ratio, I'll divide my input speed by that 2, and that will give me my output speed. I'll multiply my input torque by 2, and that'll give me my output. So for the torque, we're going to multiply. For the speed, we're going to divide. Okay? RPM or torque, we have to decide between the two. It's a trade-off. I'm trading speed for power, or vice versa. So there's my torque setup, and there's my speed setup. Both of these are still underdrive, right? They sure are. As speed increases, torque decreases, right? So as we get into higher gears, we're going faster down the road. Makes it harder to get up that hill. As torque increases, speed decreases. Think about you're on your bike and you're trying to pedal up a big hill and your feet are just pedaling away, but like it seems like you could basically be walking about as fast to make it up there. It's a pretty good example of the ideas. And our torque multiplication. So here I've got my drive gear is 8, my driven is 24, so we already did that one earlier. So 24 divided by 8 would give me that 3-to-1 ratio. And you can just see that if I'm spinning at 300 RPM, I'm going to divide that by my 3 to come up with the 100 RPM. And I'm going to multiply my torque by that 3 to come up with the 150 pound-feet of output torque. That's why I guess that's maybe why they call it torque multiplication. I don't know. Who knows? No torque multiplication. 2 gears at the same size. This is a 1-to-1 ratio. Nothing wrong with a 1-to-1 ratio, but that just means we're given what we get. And this is looking at what I was talking about before, about how there are torque and horsepower curves. Horsepower is kind of some garbage, and I think that I'll add my lecture that I usually have that talks about watt and James Watt, and about how he calculated horsepower and why I think it's stupid. But his calculation for horsepower is torque times RPM divided by this standard of 5252. And in that PowerPoint, I break it down pretty clearly as to how all these numbers came to be. But what this means is if my RPM is 5,252, right? We can cancel these out, and what we're left with is just horsepower equals torque. So on almost every single dyno chart like that, where they've graphed out the horsepower and the torque curves, there will be an intersection point of somewhere around that 5,252 mark. Math, who knew? Powertrain gear ratios. Final drive is our differential, right? And we've already dealt with diffs. I don't know if you remember back to the concept of hunting gear sets versus non-hunting gear sets, but something like a 4-to-1 ratio is a non-hunting gear set. So that means that there's one tooth on my input. There's one tooth on my input gear, which would be this one, that is going to touch 4 spots on my output gear. And it's always going to, every single revolution, that one tooth is going to touch those 4. So we get wear patterns that build up. So most of the time, gear ratios that are engineered into vehicles are considered chosen to be the non-hunting, or the hunting style, which would be like this 2.2-to-1. So that means that as the input gear drives the output gear, every tooth of that input gear over the, I don't know, it could be 10, it could be 20, it could be 30 revolutions, depending on what size these gears are. But eventually, every tooth of the input gear will touch every tooth of the output gear, which is important. It keeps wear of the gears down. It makes service of these gears a lot easier, because we would have to clock gears that had a non-hunting style ratio. And with the hunting style, it's like, well, I don't care, I just put it together and it's fine. Most people, unless they've really been explained this concept, never even think about how lucky they are that some engineer with his pocket protector and his glasses actually thought pretty hard about how the ratios matter, and we think that the engineers at Ford are all out to get us, but they haven't put a non-hunting gear ratio in anything in quite some time, so we're pretty lucky with that. A final drive, if it's a longitudinal setup, it's going to be in the back axle. If it's front-wheel drive, we move from having a transmission to having a transaxle, because the transaxle has the final drive built into it. Doesn't have to be expressed in even numbers. We talked about that with hunting versus non-hunting. If we have multiple ratios, which we're going to, because we're going to have a gear ratio inside the transmission and then a gear ratio created by the final drive, the way that you can go about combining these multiple ratios to figure out what the overall ratio of the vehicle is driven times driven times driven divided by drive times drive times drive. Totally fine way to go about it. Or you can find the individual ratios and just multiply the first numbers together, which is what we're going to do on this one here. So this would be out of like a semi. You can see that there's even this is a big brake drum. Sometimes on like the chassis cab vehicles, you'll see these on the output shaft of the transmission, and it's just a trans brake, so it's will hold the vehicle steady when everything's shut off. Here's my transmission. This is a manual. I have an auxiliary transmission, and then forward rear axle. So like I said, it's a semi. Each one of these has a gear ratio. My final drive is going to always be at that 2.73, but my transmission and my auxiliary trans can switch. Usually the auxiliary trans is just 2 gears. I don't know if you've ever heard of like truck drivers double sticking, where they have 2 stick shifts. and one's for the main transmission, one's for the auxiliary. When things started to get newer, they started building a switch in. So you'd be shifting along your main transmission, and you have to hit a switch one way or the other. Every once in a while, an electric motor actually shifts the auxiliary transmission. But a pretty common concept in the world of trucking. But I've been talking. I wonder if any of you have figured out where I'm headed with this, and I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to, not minutes, a few seconds, because let's be honest, I'm not that patient, to see if you can come up with what the overall ratio for this drivetrain would be. Here I am. I'm waiting. All right. So really all we need to do is just multiply these first numbers together. Gives me a 33.18 to 1 ratio for this vehicle. So, I mean, a semi's got to haul a big old trailer full of, 1,000 pounds worth of freight. So it starts to make it pretty clear that, okay, to get going, we need a pretty steep ratio. Physical facts of power flow. We're going to look at all this stuff as I go through the slides, so I'm not just going to read bullet points to you. But external gears are going to reverse the rotation of power flow. You see how my driving gear at the bottom is going counterclockwise, and because of the way that it's driving my top gear is going clockwise. So external gears are always going to reverse the rotation of power flow. Internal gears are going to travel in the same direction. So you see my little tiny pinion gear is spinning clockwise, and that's driving my ring gear, which has an internal tooth gear in the same direction. Oftentimes we'll use idler gears to make it so that my external gears both travel in the same direction. When we go about measuring gear ratio on something with an idler gear, the idler gear's ratio to the other two gears doesn't matter. All you really need to think about is, what is my first gear, what is my last gear, what's the relationship between those two, and in this case it looks like we'd come up with a 1-to-1, seeing as both those gears are the same size. And what would happen is, this is my drive gear. You can do the math, and I have a link to a website that shows this as well. I put it in there so that it would be like a resource when you're trying to figure out gear ratios for this week's lab. But we would have a overdrive ratio, so it'd be like something 0.0, I don't know, what does this look like, about half the size. So let's say it's a 0.5 to 1 ratio that happens here. So my drive gear spends half a rotation for one full rotation of my driven gear, and then, or my idler gear, and then the ratio between these two would be like 2 to 1. And if we go back to how we figure out what my overall ratio would be, is I would multiply 2 times 0.5, and I'm right back at my 1-to-1 ratio again. So idler gears don't matter. You can do the math on them if you want to, and you'll still come up with the right answer, but it's not worth the time, right? We're techs, we're not trying to do math any more than we have to. Here's a spur gear. They call it that because it looks like a old spur. The spur gears are nice and strong, and when a spur gear is driving another gear, the only force that's created is the two gears are both trying to force apart from each other. Just like when you push on something, right? You push on it and it just tries to go away from you in the direction that you pushed it. Spur gears are strong. And oftentimes they're used in heavy trucks because when you're getting into that industrial stuff, we're not as worried about being quiet and stuff, right? People are driving trucks for other reasons than people are buying passenger cars. But they are noisy. So when a spur gear makes contact, each time there has to be backlash. Think about our setting up a differential, right, when we measured the backlash of a ring and pinion gear. So there has to be backlash. So that means every time the gear moves on to the next tooth, there's this like little clunk that happens. And that little clunk at higher RPMs and frequencies starts to sound like a whine. So put a vehicle into reverse, back up, manual transmission, back up, and you hear. That's because there's a spur gear for that reverse gear. A little bit cheaper to create that, and also it's strong, right? But if we had to listen to that whining every time we went any like got onto the highway or went to go get groceries or whatever, it would drive you crazy. So instead we use helical gears for that, and the helical gear is really nice because it cuts down on the noise. The issue with helical gears, however, is they not only try to force themselves apart, they also force themselves apart laterally as well. And so the case that holds the helical gears has to be set up to hold the stresses in both of those directions. Helical gears are quiet though, because instead of there being full contact with another tooth as the gears rotate, what happens is the gear will be making contact with one tooth and basically slides along that tooth as the gears turn. So like the contact point, it's almost like a heel to toe type of situation where the contact slides like this, making it so that when I am starting to make contact with my next tooth of the gear, I'm still making contact with the previous one, so there's not as much of an impact that goes on between the two gears, making them much quieter, and they tend to be the choice, even for planetary gear sets. Most of those cuts are this helical cut. Bevel gears, looks kind of like a ring and pinion. They allow us to turn our power flow around a corner. And then there's our ring and pinion. So spiral bevel, same concept as the difference between a spur gear and a helical gear. Our hypoid gear set, this is not coming in at that right angle to the ring gear, makes more contact, and it also allows our drive shaft to come in a little bit lower. This is like a hybrid between a worm gear and a external gear, because it is kind of scrubbing and pushing on the ring gear as it's also twisting and pulling that ring gear down. And I look at a ring and pinion. And then there's our worm gear. Tractors will often use worm gears. They're strong, they make contact over multiple different teeth at the same time. A worm gear is interesting though, because this worm shaft has to spin to allow the worm wheel to spin. The worm wheel can never spin the worm shaft because it would just shear off all the teeth, right? So if we were driving something with a worm gear, and there were some old vehicles, I think Peugeot used to use worm gears in some of their vehicles, you had to be in the accelerator pretty much all the time, because when you let off, the wheels want to lock up. So driving a tractor, luckily you tend to drive those on in like dirt and stuff like that, so if the wheels lock up, it just, smushes some dirt out of the way. But yeah, if you're driving a tractor at any kind of speed, you have to make sure you're in the throttle all the time. If you let out real quick, all of a sudden the thing will lock up and it's like you slammed on the brakes. There is a nice little GIF of a differential, and I recommend I add all these PowerPoints to the handout for each week, and so I always recommend going back through and looking at some of these slides if you want to see something for longer. There's a PDF version which won't be moving like this, but there's the actual PowerPoint version as well, and you have access to PowerPoint through your student email. Here's a look at a final drive in a transaxle. And again, they call it the transaxle because the transmission houses the axle and differential assembly as well. Another look at the same thing. torque converter, some clutches. We have our transfer shaft, and then here would be my actual final drive. So if I knew how many teeth each one of these had, I could figure out my final drive ratio. My differential, and I think it's kind of fun that they added this on here. This would be a gear to spin an old style vehicle speed sensor where the differential spinning had a sensor that sat down in it with a little plastic gear on it, and it would just spin and act like a Hall effect sensor inside of it, and the module would then use that information to figure out how fast the vehicle was going, calculating like diameters and all that kind of preset stuff that would be programmed into it. Nowadays we just use wheel speed sensors, so we don't need that anymore. And then our last type of gear set that we're going to talk about in this slideshow is our simple planetary gear set. And in this one we have our sun gear, we have our carrier and our planetary pinions, and then the ring gear here. And then this would be part of another gear set. So this ring gear also acts as the carrier for another gear set, which is pretty cool. 6F50. Be like an Edge, Explorer. Flex has the 6F50 in it as well. Yeah, and this 6F, and I say this stuff in a few of the different lectures and notes and little demonstrations and stuff that I do, but 6F50 just means 6-speed front wheel drive, and then you multiply this by 10 to get 500 foot-pound torque capacity inside that transmission. So this ends our slideshow. Well, I guess maybe this ends our slideshow. For the moment, I've got another one that I think I'm about to do in a second, so I'll look like I'm in the exact same spot wearing the same clothes, because I will be. But I'll see you in that one in Simple Planetaries.